Trump has backed himself straight into a corner. And because the world is too distracted to recognize it, thanks to the day-to-day nonsense of US-Iranian diplomacy, we cannot even get to the deeper consequences that it has on the bigger bargaining picture. You see, when gas prices go up, they take a while to go back down. And despite the midterm elections still being months away, we are at the point where gas prices will still be elevated come the November midterm elections. Historically speaking, that has been bad for incumbent parties. But we cannot stop this conversation there. Crisis bargaining often leads to unexpected relationships, and we find ourselves with one here. The less that Iran can control electoral outcomes in November, the more that the Trump administration can press for in negotiations. The basic idea is that Iran only has leverage if its actions can help or hurt Trump, and the ship has mostly sailed on that for the midterm elections. So today, we will start with what the likely trajectory of petrol prices will be come November, and why the high numbers are sticky. Then I will review what the political science literature tells us about how voters respond to economic conditions prior to elections. Hint, it is not good for Trump. And finally, we will examine what this means for the broader negotiations with Iran. Nonetheless, let's begin with where we would expect oil prices to go. This is an interesting problem on a logistics and technology level, but it is ultimately the preface for the political problems. So I will save my energy, get it, for the later sections. The basic problem is that one does not simply restore oil to its pre-war prices following the end of a conflict. The usual explanation that you will see for this is something along the lines of, well, obviously, oil companies are greedy and want to squeeze every last cent out of consumers. And while oil companies indeed want to squeeze every last cent out of consumers, that is sort of the point of a business, market forces are what drive the slow decline in prices. We can divide the deeper explanation into 4 parts. 1. A settlement is a prerequisite for anything else happening. You may have noticed that I have stopped discussing the day-to-day happenings regarding Iran negotiations. This was not a random choice. It was deliberate on my part. Weeks before I stopped, this had already fallen into a watch, don't listen situation. The media discussion surrounding it has nonetheless persisted. Well, let me summarize things in my usual manner. I do not see anything progressing on this front. Because international negotiations are painfully opaque, it is still possible that tomorrow there will be a breakthrough, but I would not recommend spending your downtime thinking about it. Still, there is the practical implication that prices cannot begin to come down until that gets sorted out. After we get a deal done, the strait will still need to be reopened. There have been some very pessimistic estimates that it might take 6 months for that to happen. After all, Iran may have planted mines down there. It will take forever to find every last one of them. Okay, but that is not the goal here. The goal is to open up a corridor that ships can safely pass through, and give enough confidence to insurance providers that the situation is passable. That will require substantially less work than forming a completely safe waterway. I will further note that the European Union will be a part of that process to help accelerate the clearance efforts. I have been saying this from day one, despite plenty of comments indicating that I had no idea what I was talking about, and Europe would never get involved in Trump's misadventures. But as I have also said from day one, that is not how entrapment works. Entrapment, by definition, is forcing a partner to do something despite your misadventures. Europe will do what Europe needs to do to lower energy prices. The electoral consequences will be a disaster otherwise. More on that in a minute. And if you are unsure about Europe's inevitable role here, I urge you to check the news. Because the European Union has already put into place most of the mechanisms to make it happen, and is just waiting to start taking action once there are assurances that they will not be shot at. But if you missed that story, it might not have been your fault. Europe's actions here tend to be reported more by right-leaning outlets because it is a somewhat positive angle regarding the war. You know, if only there were a way to ensure that you get your news from a variety of different sources. Oh, wait, there is! It is the returning sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Their blind spot tab covers what both sides of the political spectrum miss, giving you perspective on both what you are missing out on and what you may be seeing more of than your friends across the aisle. I also like to check my daily briefing, which summarizes a handful of major stories each morning, here including one about Iran's president trying to resign and Ukraine wanting to license Patriot missiles for domestic production. And by going to ground.news/lines on maps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can take a fantastic 40% off a Vantage plan. That gives you access to the features that I have shown you here and a whole lot more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continued support of this channel. The remaining issues for restoring oil prices are more technical. If we focus on supply that is coming out of the ground and turning into something usable, we immediately run into some problems. Fun fact, war destroys things. Things like refineries along the Gulf Coast, or the infrastructure that pulls the stuff out of the ground in the first place, or the export terminals that can begin the fuel's journey to an end consumer. Most of that will not be rebuilt by the time that November rolls around. So, no, we will not have the 20 million barrels of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz by the time that the next election is held. I have one further subtle point about this. You might recall that, a few weeks ago, Iran was approaching the limit of its capacity to store oil. Well, Iran has not been pushing oil outside of the strait in the meantime, so something had to give there, and it is likely Iran having to shut down some of its wells. That is another thing that cannot just be simply turned back on after the reopening of the strait. Finally, there is the reserve problem. I know this will sound hard to believe, but oil prices have been partially suppressed over the last 3 months. Countries have looked at the drop in supply and responded by releasing strategic oil reserves onto the market. As of May 13th, the last day that we have data for, it was 164 million barrels released. Projecting that out to today, we would be at about 200 million, roughly half of what countries have pledged to make available. This represents about 11% of the lost supply. When oil starts leaving Hormuz, those countries will begin closing off their strategic reserves, negating some of the change in supply. Much later on, they will begin to restock their reserves, which artificially inflates demand. This is one of the major reasons that oil prices take a long time to eventually return to a baseline level. The one caveat that I need to add going forward is that ending the war at any point between now and November will generate immediate relief for oil markets. And the more time between a settlement and the election, the more that prices will decline. Consequently, negotiations with Iran will still affect proximate gas prices. It is just that the extent of the relief is limited before November. Okay, having established that gas prices will take a long time to sink back down to the neighborhood of pre-war levels, let's talk about the effect that it will have on the 2026 midterm elections. Now, it might be tempting to declare that the situation is obviously bad for the Trump administration, and then walk away from the conversation. You might even have a sense of why the situation is bad, specifically as it relates to gas prices. If you recall the 1979 oil crisis, and what that did to Jimmy Carter's bid for re-election. Hint, Reagan became president. But somehow the reality of the situation is worse in some ways, and better in others from how it might seem. As a general point, we spend a lot of time in these videos discussing what strategic play looks like. And that makes a lot of sense when our focus is on leader-level decisions. I know it is fun for keyboard warriors to mock leaders for being bad at their jobs, but it is hard to stay in power for long without having a good feel for what is wise and what is not. Where silly things tend to happen, it is usually because either the leaders face institutional constraints that prevent them from taking better paths, or their preferences are not in line with what the public wants or what leaders traditionally care about. In contrast, I am under no delusion that the average voter behaves in a manner that is strategically sound. Voting happens too infrequently, and the marginal impact that any one person's vote has is too minimal for voters to even have an incentive to get better at it. And so voters have all sorts of behavioral quirks that we repeatedly see in elections. Usually the studies of these effects consider presidential elections, but take a leap of faith with me and think about how the same issues will arise when midterm elections are a de facto referendum on the president, which they are. Perhaps the best known of these behavioral quirks is that voters care about what has recently happened with the economy. That contrasts with a holistic approach of what the candidate has done over the entire term. And let's not even pretend that the average voter tries to create a benchmark to compare the candidate to, rather than just look at whether the number is going up or down. For example, it would not matter as much that the economy grew 10% last year if it stayed stagnant this year. In fact, for electoral purposes, 0 growth last year and 10% growth this year is strictly better, even though we would be economically worse off in the latter case. Actually, if you have been following all of the drama that surrounds control over the Federal Reserve, and thus the ability to set interest rates, this will all start to make sense. Presidents have strong incentives to juice the economy on the eve of elections, to the detriment of the long-term health of the country. Fed independence is critical to stopping that. Also, if the general economic situation was so good that your average president could get 20% growth, this hypothetical president would not be punished much. He still grew the economy 10%, even though that was half as good as it should have been. Again, the average voter does not benchmark. 10% growth is a large number, and that is the end of the story. Anyway, the lesson here is bad news for Trump. Economic indicators did not look too bad for 2025, despite Trump's best efforts to create an economic calamity with an endless stream of tariff threats. But that will be effectively irrelevant for the 2026 midterms. On the other hand, the news is not as bad as it may seem for Trump for a variety of reasons. One, in the modern era of political polarization, there are fewer swing voters as it is. Thus, the percentage of movable people who will be moved is high, but there are not as many of them as there were 30 years ago. Second, and I know that this is going to sound bizarre, but Trump is primarily going to be punished for higher gas prices. He is going to be less punished as being the cause of higher gas prices. Put differently, high prices are bad for Trump regardless of the cause. It is funny because presidents routinely get punished for higher gas prices despite having very little control over them. Now, in the one situation where the president did have a lot of control over them, the situation is reversed. And to return to an earlier point on that front, this is the reason why Europe will help open the strait. Even if European voters do not like the idea of their country helping Trump, voters will punish European leaders for high gas prices, even though they were not the ones responsible for the affair. To reiterate, back in the United States, there was a clear path to not run into the problem. Simply do not start the Iran war. But there is a sizable subset of voters who would vote against Republicans purely because gas prices are high, whether it was due to the Iran war or a natural disaster that took the Gulf Coast refineries offline. Again, I know that this will sound weird to you. However, by virtue of watching this video, you are a high information voter and likely in the 90th percentile on that metric. You are abnormal, in a good way, and your understanding of these issues will not match the average voter. I will say, though, that the Iran war is a high saliency issue, so the dampening effect will not be as strong as if Trump had pursued a more subtle policy that led to the same increase in prices. Lastly, gas prices will likely be falling by the time that November rolls around. Voters actually do pay attention to derivatives at the time of the election. It will be better for Trump if gas prices are $4 and dropped 25 cents over the last week than if gas prices were $4 and increased 25 cents over the last week. Bottom line is that the situation looks pretty ugly for Trump, at least on this front, and that at least caveat may tell you where we are going from here. Indeed, as a final point, we should zoom out and understand how this affects bigger picture issues with the Iran negotiations. Let me begin this with a preface. I do not want to suggest that I know what bargaining friction is keeping the economic war/light military operations ongoing. We could have a long conversation about Netanyahu's domestic concerns about prosecutions after the war ends, and then we can tie that to the United States getting entrapped. Then there are Trump's own personal benefits. At the top of the list is stopping the media and Congress from investigating other areas. The folks at the Pentagon might be seriously concerned about nuclear weapons and shifting power. And watching Iran's proposals, it is easy to conclude that both sides cannot agree on what the expected outcome of the war is. I further need to preface this by saying that we cannot fully understand how altering the bargaining environment affects expectations of war and peace outcomes, unless we know what the bargaining friction is. But I can say that the first-order effect of elevated gas prices past November is to strengthen Trump's bargaining position. Let me be clear. I am not saying that this is good for the Trump administration or Americans overall. Welfare for both of those parties also incorporates electoral outcomes and economic wealth. Rather, I am just talking about bilateral, zero-sum bargaining outcomes between the United States and Iran. Remember that in the canonical setup, the cost of war is an opportunity cost, the losses from fighting combined with the extra benefits of peace. Presumably, Trump cares about the 2026 midterms, because they will determine his ability to pass legislation for the following 2 years, and the number of congressional subpoenas that he will face. He also does not much care about what happens between then and 2028, because that will be someone else's problem. Thus, for a while, Trump may very well have internalized higher costs for war. Iran, in turn, could have leveraged his problem with midterm elections to extract a better deal. At this point, though, and in contrast to what is happening along the Strait, that ship has sailed, or at least mostly sailed. Iran has lost the leverage of the threat because Trump is already stuck with the problem one way or another. Visually, that means a collapsing U.S. cost line, which raises the minimum that the Trump administration would accept. Now, presumably, Iran was aware of all of this and let it happen anyway. That would suggest that Iran believed that fighting over the long haul would still be better in expectation, which might indicate that there will still be a substantial amount of time before the war ends. Keep in mind, though, that such a prediction does not necessarily hold when we scrutinize the problem with an explicitly defined bargaining friction. For example, if Iran incorrectly believed that the Trump administration would fold a month ago because it is especially vulnerable to the political ramifications of the midterm elections, then the rejected offer tells Iran what it needs to know to get a deal done. Iran essentially miscalculated, and now it must correct for its mistake. The fact that Iran will now do worse is just a side effect. However, the consequences of a narrower bargaining range could still dominate, leaving us further from a deal than we were before. It is a giant theoretical mess. So, what are our takeaway lines for today? We have reached the point where it is nearly impossible for gas prices to return anywhere near their pre-war levels by November. The research on gas prices, general economics, and elections indicate that the last few months of signals before an election matter much more than what the economic situation looks like overall, which is a bad sign for Trump. The only upsides are that voters care about the direction of the economy, and the current political environment is incredibly polarized. Regardless, the weird consequence of the administration's lost hope for the midterm elections is that it now has stronger bilateral bargaining power vis-a-vis Iran. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to take a fantastic 40% off Advantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.